أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين شفيع المذنبين وحبيب قلوب الصادقين سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على وعلى أهل بيته الأطيبين الأطهرين الهداة المهديين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد فقد قال الله عز وجل بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم لقد جاءكم رسول من أنفسكم عزيز عليه ما عنتم حريص عليكم بالمؤمنين رؤوف رحيم صلوا على محمد وآل محمد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Before I begin tonight's discussion, we have been requested to recite Surah Fatiha for Marhum Mazhar Ali Beg, son of Humayun Ali Beg, who passed away recently. May Allah have mercy on Marhum and on all other departed Muslims. Please recite Surah Fatiha for Marhum Mazhar Ali Beg, preceded by Salawat ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Bismillah. For the last few nights of Muharram, we talked about some aspects of the seerah and the practice and the legacy of the Prophet, which are important for us to remember as Muslims, but in some cases which it is easy for us to neglect because they are not always the visible and the apparent parts of the Prophet's legacy and his practice. And I think that some of the dimensions that we have spoken about, they are topics that will be worthy of greater thought and reflection and research by all of us, and perhaps we will have an opportunity to discuss some of these areas and other areas of the Prophet's legacy and his practice in future sessions. There is one topic that I wanted to broach during this series of discussions, but I wanted to wait until after the day of Ashura had passed. And so I will begin today with a question. And that is a question which I don't want to fully answer in tonight's session. It is something that I think our communities need to think about. There is not going to be a clear right and wrong answer. There is not going to be an easy ability to say that this is one extreme and this is the other extreme and we are right in the middle. That's what Muslims have a habit of doing, that our religion is a religion of moderation and of balance. And of course it is a religion of moderation and balance. But moderation and balance is defined by how you define the extremes. For some people, we want to reach a certain conclusion, and so we define our extremes as somebody who is this far in this direction and this far in the other direction. But for another person, what we define as the extreme is what they consider to be the happy medium. And so it's not always just a simple question of saying these are extremes and this is in the middle. My point, though, in addressing this issue is that we need to think as individuals, and we need to be able to have a more educated and a well thought out position about how we are going to live in a world and in a Muslim community which has different thoughts and different perspectives, and unfortunately in the time that we are living, sometimes even hostility towards Muslims who are even very slightly opposed to their own background and their own school of thought. We hope and we pray that these periods of sectarianism and hostility, they pass quickly. But if we are in that environment, we have to know how to deal with it, and we have to give some thought to this issue. One note, generally, it is when people feel vulnerable, when people are attacked, when people feel that they are under attack, that they lash out in these ways. The Muslim Ummah, of course, is going through a period of trial. It is going through a period of vulnerability and transition, and that is when these types of events, they seem to become far more prominent and far more pronounced. And this is not a permanent condition. The belief that some non-Muslims have, that the Shia and the Sunni, they have been at each other's throats for 1400 years, that is not true. It is a caricature. It is false. And if some Muslims have that impression, we also should not fall into the trap of viewing things so simplistically. But there have certainly been periods where those tensions and even violence and aggression has flared up. So the question that I wanted to broach is, when we are in our Muslim community, in our ummah, in our society, to what extent should we make a concession, or should we factor in the views of other people and their thoughts and their prejudice and sometimes even their ignorance in terms of our own practice and our own decision making? We can't just say that there is a sliding scale. The mushrikeen of Mecca, they came to the Prophet and they said that this Allah that you talk about will make our peace with him. And the history is not very detailed and very clear, but it appears they may even have been willing to say that the Prophet's God is the supreme God. It's not one God among many gods, but Allah is the supreme deity, the authority over all other authorities. But they wanted to maintain their tribal gods and their tribal identity and worship as well. So they were not telling the Prophet, you have to eliminate Allah. But they were saying, don't eliminate Lat and Manat and Uzza and Hubal. Keep them. Now, there is a false story, and that's not my topic. Some of you may have heard about the false story known as Qissatul Gharaniq that was attributed to the seerah of the Prophet. It is not authentic and not accurate. Certainly the Shia do not accept it, neither on historical grounds nor on theological grounds. And even many of the scholars of the non-Shia schools of thought, they also have rejected it. This hadith says that the Prophet did compromise in some way and say some nice words about some of the idols. And then Allah revealed that this is not something which was from him, it was from shaitan. And those nice words which had been falsely attributed to the Quran, they were eliminated, and the Prophet was told not to compromise with shirk. From the perspective of followers of Ahlul Bayt, that story is incorrect from its very foundation and from its root. The Prophet never compromised with shirk. He never wanted or never said any personal words in favor of idols, let alone for the Prophet to attribute verses in praise of idols to divine revelation. In fact, we believe that even before Islam, the Prophet did not bow down to an idol. Even before Islam, the Prophet did not eat food that had been slaughtered to an idol and not in the name of Allah. He had maintained the Sharia and the religion and the monotheism of Ibrahim, ala nabiyyina wa alihi wa alayhi salam, even before he was officially appointed as a messenger of God. So we don't have an absolute relative or sliding scale, where if there are mushrikeen, we say that we will compromise with your gods, and you will compromise with our God, and we will have one big, happy, spiritual community, one human family. But then, what are the guidelines that we can use to gauge where to say what? The most important examples, of course, are the personalities who are honored and who are respected by the broad community of Muslims as the companions of the Prophet, as followers of the Prophet, as the sources of Islamic law and Islamic teachings and Islamic guidance. And some of whom, scholars and researchers and people who have some insight into history, may believe were not actually loyal and able to fulfill the demands of their religious commitment. These personalities, these individuals, some of whom were long-standing companions of the Prophet, some of whom were related by blood or by marriage to the Prophet, some of whom had other ties or who were prominent in the early Islamic community, they have some prestige associated with them in the view and in the conscience of many Muslims. But then there are some of us, many of us who are familiar with the inside story or the unwritten history of Ahlul Bayt and the sufferings of the progeny of the Prophet. We know that it was not just a matter of these people being the bearers of the Islamic religion. In some cases, they were the ones who allowed division and who allowed oppression to creep into Islamic society. So now how are we to deal with this? And what is to be the basis of our practice and our words? If there is somebody who is respected by many Muslims as a noble person, and we know that person may have had some attributes or many attributes which make them unworthy of that veneration, we have at the extremes two options. Now, I said that the extremes are defined relative to where we stand. And so I want to just put two posts in order for us to evaluate where we stand without any kind of claim that these are completely objective margins or red lines or borders. On the one hand, what we can do is we can say that it is not so important for us to take a specific stand about an individual or about a person or about an event. We have principles, we have overriding values, we have some standards, and we can talk about those standards and those values, and we can leave the judgment up to Allah. So we can say that may Allah send His la'an and remove from His mercy all of those who oppressed anybody and did not repent. But then was it X who repented, or was it Y? Was it so-and-so, or was it not so-and-so? That is not something that we have to express or that we even have to decide on our own. The other possibility, of course, is that we can say that we will mention what we know, we will speak and explicitly announce the truth, and if some people like it, then they are welcome to join us. If some people are offended, then that is not our concern, it is their concern. They need to educate themselves, they need to learn the background, and then they can either decide that we were right and justified in what we said and believed, or they can decide that we don't have a justification and they can go in their own path. So these are what we will use now as the two limits of our debate, the two extremes, and then we will see where and how we are to try to maintain our practice within them. The progeny of the Prophet, if you will examine their teachings, they did chart a specific type of course. And that course was not just some undefined middle ground, but it was something that had a particular method, and it had a particular form of a wisdom which allowed Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam to fulfill their spiritual mission and their purpose within Islamic society. The Imams were not just Imams for a small band of followers. When we discuss the lives of our Imams, we are used to hearing the extreme praise which all of the Imams, they have attracted even from people who were not believers in Imamat. And so when Shafi'i, or when Malik ibn Anas, or when other prominent Sunnis, some of whom were known more in the past, but they're not as well known today, or they are known in scholarly circles, like Sufyan al-Thawri, or Abdullah ibn Mubarak, or Ata ibn Abi Rabah, or others who may not be as widely known among the general Muslim public, but they are prominent Muslim scholars and followers of the companions, tabi'een, and later generations. When they praise the Imams, then they are not praising Imamat, and they are not praising Isma, and in many cases, they are not even praising some of those stories of the miracles and the prominence of the Imams that you and I are familiar with, because they don't believe in them or they might not be aware of them. What they are praising is in some cases not even the legal opinions of the Imams, because they were not aware of those legal opinions, or if they were aware of them, they thought of them as one of the legal schools among many others. If you look at history, then some of the students of our fourth Imam, Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salatu wassalam, please recite another salawat. Some of the students of our fourth Imam, they were among the scholars of Medina. There was a generation in the period of the followers of the companions, in the period of Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salatu wasalam, and soon afterwards, when there were 7 fuqaha who were known as the al-fuqaha us-sab'a, the 7 grand scholars of Medina. They were known as members of the large jama'ah. It wasn't called Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. That title came many generations later. But the word jama'ah was used. So they were part of the jama'ah. They were part of the large congregation of Muslims. They were not known as followers of the Imam. Some of them were very close to and were students of the fourth Imam, but they would be people whose fatwa were often in agreement with the prevailing practice of Medina. In some cases, some of their fatwa were in accord with the practice of Ahlul Bayt, but not all of their rulings and all of their practice. So these fuqaha sab'a, these 7 fuqaha, they were jurists in Medina, and there were similar scholars in Mecca, there were similar scholars in Iraq, in Kufa, in Basra, in Sham, in Syria. These people were influenced by Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salatu wasalam. In some of our hadith, it is mentioned that some of these prominent students or contemporaries of our Imam were actually Ahlul Wilaya. They were people who believed in the Wilaya of the Imams as well, even though there might be a historical debate about that, and it cannot be said conclusively. That is a general factor about the life of our fourth Imam, which some of you may be familiar with. Because it was a time of shadid taqiyya, of very severe taqiyya, of great oppression, and it was a time when people were not able to express their loyalty to Ahlul Bayt publicly. We don't always know all of the details about the relationships and the loyalty and the obedience of people towards our fourth Imam. We have, for example, Mukhtar ibn Abi Ubaid al-Thaqafi, who avenged many of the events of Karbala. So there is a question in history that yes, he had a love for Ahlul Bayt. Yes, he put to death many of the criminals who were involved in the tragedy of Karbala, but we cannot say conclusively that he was doing so under the orders of or with a loyalty to and obedience of the fourth Imam. Even though our Imams have said that later Imams, Imam Muhammad Baqir alayhi salam, Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam, they are reported to have said that in general terms, he is to be considered somebody who is worthy of mercy and salvation. So similarly, we have other people, for example, among these fuqaha whom I mentioned, one figure is Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib. A very prominent person. He figures in hadith narrators. He figures among the scholars of Quran, the scholars of fiqh, the scholars of hadith. And according to the Sunni community, he will be considered to be a prominent Sunni scholar. He was also, I believe, the son-in-law of Abu Huraira. And so some of the traditions which have come from Abu Huraira, they have come through Sa'id ibn Musayyib. But we have a hadith from the Shia and from the Imams that he was one of those who had a loyalty to our fourth Imam and was a follower of Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salatu wassalam. It might seem difficult to reconcile these things, but we can find other examples as well of people who were loyal to the Imams, but they didn't have that ability to publicly proclaim so. My point is not to speak of Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib in particular, but of a general reality which existed in that time. The conclusion that is important, and that is beyond a specific instance of one person or another person, is that these people who expressed an admiration for Ahlul Bayt, they did so because Ahlul Bayt, they had a way of existing within the world, the Islamic world, that allowed them not to alienate mainstream Islamic opinion. And yet, they also were able to do so in such a way that they preserved the true and the pristine teachings of Islam from being extinguished and eliminated within Islamic society. Now, I want to just quickly address one question that some people have, and this is a question that comes from students, from scholars, about different areas. Recently there was a question about fasting on the day of Ashura, for example. And similar types of questions come from many different directions, so I want to answer that question in a very general way, and then continue with my discussion. Please recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ala. The question is this. There are ahadith narrated from the Imams, and they are recorded in some of our Shi'i books of hadith. The example that I gave earlier was that fasting on Ashura is good, it is recommended, it is a kaffara, an atonement for the previous year, for example. And in some cases, the chain of transmission of these ahadith is also something which is considered authentic or reliable by the standards of our scholars. We also have many ahadith which strongly discourage the fasting on Ashura, and they say that this is something which is the practice of Banu Umayyah, and it is not something which has an Islamic basis. It was done to celebrate their defeat of Imam Hussein, and fasting is not something which a follower of Imam Hussein should practice on the day of Ashura. To remain hungry for the greater portion of the day in mourning is fine, but not with the intention of fasting. So we have these ahadith. I just want to mention this one example. I'm not going to address this one question comprehensively, although I will say 2 points. In the first place, even among the literature of the non-Shia school of thought, there is a hadith narrated from Aisha, the wife of the Prophet, in which she says that this was prescribed by the Prophet. It was ordered by the Prophet, the fasting of Ashura, as the first fast for Muslims, before the fasting of the month of Ramadan had been revealed. When the original order of fasting was revealed, and the Quran says, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الصِّيَامُ كَمَا كُتِبَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ. The fasting which the Jews practiced, and which they practice until today, is the fasting of Ashura. They fast on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur corresponds to the day of Ashura. So this is what Aisha says, that this was the practice of the Jews. And when the Quran says that fasting is prescribed for you, like it was prescribed for those before you, then the Prophet's first order was to fast like the Jews fasted, or on the day the Jews fasted. But then the very next verses of Surah Baqarah, they speak about Shahr Ramadan, they speak about the month of Ramadan. And she says that after that, the fasting of Ashura was abrogated, and the fasting of Ramadan was instituted as an obligation. And then that hadith says that some people who wish, they can fast. It's a day like any other day, but there is no recommendation to fast on that day. So it's not just from the Shia perspective that there is a question mark about the fasting on the day of Ashura. Even from a non-Shia perspective, there is no certainty and there is no conclusive reason to say that fasting on Ashura must be done. But the question is that when we have a hadith like this, sometimes with a reasonable chain of transmission, that seem to say something which is against the majority opinion of the Shia scholars, or against what we know to be the practice of the Shia community and the fatwa and the rulings of Shia scholars. Some people, they see this and they get shaken. If somebody translates a few of these ahadith, then they think that, well, maybe all of our fuqaha from the time of Imam Ja'far Sadiq until today, they never opened this book of hadith and they never realized that these are correct ahadith, and how are they going to reconcile or resolve these issues? But the answer, it comes much more clearly if we understand the reality of the lives of the imams. When you have oppression and when you have an underground movement, then by default and by necessity, there are going to be two messages that you are going to have to give. The public line is the line that is going to reduce tension and eliminate ill will with the broader community. And the private line is that which is going to be teachings which it might not be possible to give publicly. Now, that is something which is a general principle. It does not mean that the imams' private teachings were in conflict with their public teachings. That was a mistake that was made by some people who became known as the Batiniya. And they had a history after the imams as well, and with different names and some schools of thought, they still maintain those Batini teachings. Batiniya, or those people, they said that the secret teachings of the imams were separate and in some cases opposed to the public teachings of the imams. So publicly the imams would talk about salat and saum, but in secret the imams would say that salat is really a person, you love that person and you are in God's good books, and the khamr and maisir, drinking and gambling and all of these evil things, the superficial element is that it is a forbidding for gambling, a forbidding for alcohol, but in secret it really means that you have to hate certain people. They are the personification of evil, and these secret teachings were contrary to the public teachings. That is a false accusation against the imams. But the imams did have, by necessity, a secret teaching. Their secret teaching was not in contradiction to their public teaching, but their secret teaching was to complete and to add those things which were the deeper understanding of Sharia, which would affirm the superficial and the surface legal rulings and teachings of Sharia in a way that it was not always possible for them to do publicly. There are examples, for example, where our imams would sometimes say explicitly that my father had to do taqiyya about this issue because of circumstances. But I am in a position where I do not have to do taqiyya. There are examples for Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam, where he says that this was the ruling of Imam Muhammad Baqir, and it's not false. He did say it, and it might be narrated with a very correct chain of transmission, but he was under compulsion. And now I am going to clarify the actual teachings and the actual proper sunnah of the Prophet. And there are also examples from Imam Ali al-Rida alayhi salatu wasalam and some of our other imams as well. The basic point is that when you have oppression, when you have censorship, when you have an inability to speak publicly, then naturally you will have to say something publicly which diffuses tension. It's not lying, it's not falsifying, it is diplomacy. And diplomacy is not something which is a dishonor. It is something which is very important, and a person cannot look at the seerah of the Prophet and the verses of the Quran without seeing the beauty of the Prophet's diplomacy. So taqiyya, which is seen as something, as an accusation against the Shia, that should be something which is actually a point of pride. The Prophet dealt with the munafiqeen in such a gentle way that according to the ahadith found in Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, and I've mentioned these previously in talks, so I won't mention the details, but the Prophet did not disclose the munafiqeen whom he knew would damage his ummah and who were alive and whose identity remained a secret even until the Prophet was on his deathbed. This is a hadith which is authenticated by all Muslims who believe in Bukhari and all Muslims who believe in Muslim at the very least. That there were hypocrites who the Prophet did not disclose the identity of until the day that he died. And their identity will be disclosed, according to that hadith, on the Day of Judgment. Some of us might say that subsequent events disclose their identity, but regardless of that, it will be disclosed on the Day of Judgment at the very least. What can that be explained as except diplomacy? How can that be understood except that the Prophet himself had certain teachings, certain messages, certain aspects of his guidance that he was not able to explain explicitly because of the needs of society, and so he maintained some things implicitly and some things explicitly. The Imams continued that practice, but because the nature of the Imams' oppression was different, some of the things that they had to speak of diplomatically included certain legal rulings of Islam. They sometimes even included certain areas of Islamic creed and Islamic practice. This was part of their diplomacy. Now, the nature of the teachings of the Imams was such that they compromised or they explained many things in such a way that one might think that they had an agreement with the broad outlines of what Muslims were following. But within those words of the Imams, there was usually some hint that there is more to the story, and people need to think, and they need to contemplate, and they need to make sure that they are not just looking at the surface. So it wasn't that the Imams would speak with diplomacy and people would not be able to figure out what they really meant. This is the art that we as followers of the Imams need to learn. And it needs to be practiced in different ways at different times, in different societies. There are environments where Muslims have been separated from parts of their identity, where Muslims may not have a very sectarian identity, and it may be possible to speak about certain things with a great deal of explicitness. And there are some areas, for example, parts of the Arab world, where praising Imam Ali too much by itself can raise people's sensitivities. What are you trying to say? Where speaking about some people with too much explicitness can make people feel that you have an ulterior motive. And we can see that and we can witness that in our environment. As a follower of Ahlul Bayt, we should be able to figure and to examine how it is that we can proclaim our message using diplomacy in these different contexts. We don't want to go to a point where we forget principles and where we just speak about generalities. There is no point in saying, may Allah curse the oppressors, if we are never going to connect that to any oppressor in history or in our time. Why would Allah even need to curse them? Allah knows what He's going to do in the hereafter. He doesn't need our prayers or our words in order to affirm what His job and His determination and His judgment is going to be in the hereafter. If la'natullahi ala al-zalimeen is only meant to be for the hereafter, and it's never meant to be applied to any individual in this world, then why have us say it in the first place? The only reason why we would say it is because it's going to motivate our actions. It's going to bring us close to some people and it's going to move us away from some people. It's going to give us love for certain people and it's going to give us animosity and a rejection of certain people. And if not for that, then why even say, may Allah send His mercy on the righteous and may Allah send His imprecation and may Allah curse those who are unworthy and unrighteous. There is no purpose if it is not meant to have a practical effect. But that practical effect should be conveyed in a diplomatic way. For today, I want to just conclude with this reminder that the Imams focused on the events of Karbala as the best means of bringing this diplomacy into practice. Because the events of Karbala were such that every Muslim with a conscience admits that it was a tragedy that befell the entire Muslim Ummah. I don't think most of my audience has a great deal of admiration for Ibn Taymiyyah, the source of inspiration for many of the enemies of Ahlul Bayt, many of the enemies of Ahlul Sunnah. He was declared a kafir by the ulama of Ahlul Sunnah. And the majority of their killing and their plundering was done against Ahlul Sunnah before Shia. So I don't think many of us have much admiration for him. But Ibn Taymiyyah very vehemently deplores and curses those who martyred Imam Hussein. Now, he might absolve Yazid of guilt, but in principle, he admits that the events of Karbala cannot be justified. And whoever was responsible is not worthy of God's forgiveness or mercy. Abdullah ibn Umar. He was not somebody who supported or who joined Imam Hussein, but he is reported in history as having said, when somebody came and asked him for a fatwa about what would happen if a person is in Hajj in a state of ihram and kills an insect. And his reply was that you martyr the grandson of the Prophet of God, and then you come and ask me what happens if a pilgrim martyrs an insect, kills an insect. Mus'ab ibn Zubayr, the brother of Abdullah ibn Zubayr. Abdullah ibn Zubayr, we mentioned him. He is the claimant to caliphate who wishes to put to death the surviving son of Imam Ali, Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiyyah. He imprisons Bani Hashim. He refuses to send salawat on the Prophet and his progeny, sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Because of his animosity for the heirs of the Prophet. His brother Mus'ab ibn Umair has composed marthiyah, poetry, eulogies for the martyrs of Karbala, and says that they are our role model and they have given an example for noble people to follow for all time. So this is something, my point is that Karbala is something which is a matter of consensus. Even those who may have had no sympathy for and no love for Ahlul Bayt, they have admitted that the events of Karbala, they were a deep tragedy. And so our first priority should be to convey the message of Karbala and to try to speak of the events of Karbala in such a way that it can reach the maximum number of people. And it can shake people's conscience. And initially some people might say, this was a terrible tragedy. But it was Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad. And it was Shamir ibn Dhil Jawshan or Shimr ibn Dhil Jawshan. It was perhaps Shabath ibn Rib'i. It was perhaps these evil people who were present on the battlefield. It wasn't Yazid. When he found out about it, he regretted it. And he criticized what Ibn Ziyad did. And the first step might be that people will say that. But then, of course, if they understand Karbala, and if it becomes part of their conscience, eventually, at least one would hope the question would come into their mind that fine, if you say Yazid never ordered the events of Karbala, he never commanded it, and he wasn't happy with it. Yazid survived for almost 3 years after Karbala. Does history preserve that he even once said to Ubaydullah that you need to be put to death and punished? Forget punishing. Was there any kind of message sent that you are no longer governor of Kufa because this is the city where the captives of Karbala were sent? Was there any form of reprimand, any form of punishment? Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad was not a governor of Yazid. Muawiyah had falsely claimed that Ziyad ibn Abi was his brother by breaking the laws of Islam. So Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad was falsely claimed as the cousin and a prince of the Umayyad dynasty. Was he ever reprimanded? That question will come up. And when that question comes up, then it will open the door for many other questions and inshallah increased insight among those who will listen to and find out about Karbala. So this was one of the founding principles of the teachings of the Imams. That if you need to sometimes speak respectfully about some of the companions and some of the family members and some of the affiliates and some of the wives of the Prophet who may or may not be worthy of that form of deference, that is not the first priority. We are not going to solve the issues of Islam by discussing Khalid ibn Walid, because Khalid ibn Walid is not a central figure who was responsible for damaging the message of Islam. And some of those central figures, they are figures whose lives have been mythologized and people don't know the truth. And so we begin from an area which can be a source of consensus, and then we use that in order to increase understanding. So I will conclude this portion of our talk, but the question is something which we need to continue to think about and to examine. How is it possible for us to maintain a recognition of our principles without alienating and sending away people who need to hear the message? Karbala is one of those focal points which our Imams used and which our Imams emphasized. But the condition is that we do so in a way which is able to bring that message to people who are not fully aware of what it is and what its implications are. Today I would like to discuss the martyrdom of one of those people who was a martyr of Karbala, but he was not present in Karbala. After the events of Karbala, the caravan of the captives and the family of the Prophet, it was very harshly and very cruelly brought to the gates of Kufa. And in the city of Kufa, as the narrations tell us, Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad thought that he had finally achieved a victory. He was in a mood for celebration. The city was prepared for an Eid, as if it was a day of celebration. We're talking about a day or two after Ashura. And when the city had been readied, the inhabitants of Kufa were told, come into the masjid. And now Ubaydullah, he gave a sermon. In that sermon, he spoke whatever evil he could against Ahlul Bayt. He cursed Imam Ali. He cursed Imam Hassan. He cursed Imam Hussein. He spoke ill of their values, of their followers, of their family. And he said that God has shown that their claim is false, because if God had wanted, He could have supported them. The fact that those who were martyred have been martyred and those who were made captive have been made captive, that proves that Yazid is right. And there's thousands of people in the masjid of Kufa listening to these poisonous words. But this is Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad. If he can kill the grandson of the Prophet, what would he do to anybody who was listening and dared to respond? But Allah had saved one person for that assembly. And that was a person from the tribe of Azd, known as Abdullah ibn Ufayf or Abdullah ibn Afif, an old man, and a long-standing follower of Ahlul Bayt, a loyal follower of Ahlul Bayt. It is said that he fought in Jabal and he fought in Siffin. And he was blinded in those battles through the injuries he received. His job at that time was to sit in the mosque of Kufa and to teach people how to recite the Quran. Abdullah stood up. He said that, Ibn Ziyad, do you think that you have achieved a victory? But let me tell you who Allah has given the lie to, and who is a falsifier, and who does not deserve even the name of a Muslim. It is you, and it is that person who declared that you are to rule over us, a community of Muslims. You are not worthy of the name Muslim, and the one who made you a governor over us is not worthy of the name Muslims, and we will never make our peace with you. And so Ubaydullah was taken aback. He ended his sermon, and he ordered his soldiers to arrest Abdullah ibn Ufayf. Now there is a battle which is taking place in Kufa. Captives are either outside the gates of the city, or they have already been put in one of the dungeons underground in the city of Kufa. And residents of Kufa know where those captives are. But it is only a defender of Ahlul Bayt who has hundreds of swords brandished, surrounding him and protecting him in the masjid. And they said to Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad that this is a Muslim. He taught some of our children how to recite Quran. He is a noble person. We shall not allow him to be harmed in any way. And so Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad had to prevent his soldiers from making the arrest at that time. Later on, in the darkness of night, he sent some soldiers and they arrested, and then they martyred Abdullah ibn Ufayf. But imagine the tragedy of Ahlul Bayt. When they heard the news of this martyr joining the ranks of their lovers and their followers, certainly they must have felt a great deal of pride at the loyalty and the sincerity and the sacrifice of Abdullah ibn Ufayf. But would it also have pained their heart to say that if Ubaydullah taught one surah of Quran to a child, and the parents of that child would have said that we would not want him to be arrested before our eyes. We will not allow harm to come to him. But those who are heirs of the Prophet, those whom the Prophet expressed his love for, those whom the Prophet cradled in his own arms and caressed with his hands, those whom the Prophet brought up and had given so much guidance and so much blessing and so many prayers to the Muslim community. Lady Zainab, who lived 4 years in Kufa, teaching and guiding and showering her generosity upon all of the people. There is to be no mercy, there is to be no sword brandished to free them from captivity. And so they spent that night in captivity, with their wounds untreated, with their children still weeping from their loss, with blood still gushing from their wounds and from what they had suffered at the hands of their enemies, with their thirst unquenched, and with their hunger still unmet. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had decreed that test for them. May Allah have mercy upon Muhammad wa ali Muhammad and their followers and their lovers, and may He count us among their true supporters in this world and in the hereafter. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Let us recite a Surah Fatiha for all mu'mineen, and especially for those who have requested us to remember them in our prayers on this night, after salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim.
Yasin.